Exodus and Numbers, you understand the struggles that they faced in the wilderness. You know that it was extremely difficult to live, or at least as a leader of God's people there, for Moses to live among the people that constantly complained. And they were influenced heavily by the idolatry that was around them. And so he uses that as an illustration. He illustrates the tragic consequences of rejecting God's blessings for the things of the world. And he brings in idolatry. He talks about some other things there as well. We can clearly see, though, he's emphasizing that the people were saved by a cloud and a rock. Did you see that? A cloud and a rock. Now, Paul uses Christ to illustrate this. And he of course, is referencing the church, baptism for remission of sins. And he has a hard time really writing anything without talking about baptism, which I find that interesting. Paul can use any illustration to talk about baptism. And here he ties it in with how they were saved in the wilderness. He also talks about laziness. You see here, he's talking about these idolatrous feasts and sexual immorality, which we've talked about in this series already, that ultimately would destroy them. And he says these are things you need to avoid. And then to tell them the danger of sexual immorality and idolatry, he says, I want to remind you of the time that 23,000 people died because of it. Weakness was a severe temptation for the people in Corinth. Second of all, they were following the wisdom of the world. And so he references that. Now, I want to point out something about the Corinthian culture you may or may not know. And that is that they felt themselves to be a very educated society. They were very affluent, and they were very well educated. And so people knew that when they went to Corinth, you could go to the library, you could go and visit the museums. In fact, I had several photos I wanted to show throughout this series, and I'll probably get to them later on. They were proud of their education, and they were proud of their court system. They had a legal system. This is a place where if you were a lawyer, this is where you wanted to get a job in Corinth. Boy, you could make some money. And we've already noted that in previous chapters, haven't we? That they thought, well, hey, if we got a problem, let's just take it to the court system. It's a good court system. We'll just let them handle it. And so Paul begins to kind of show this and say, if you're really wise, if you were as smart as you thought you were, you'd pay attention to what I'm about to say to you. Now that's a clue there, that they were so smart they thought Paul's words were beneath them. How sad is it? Sometimes people, when confronted by the words of an apostle, will say, that was for then, but I'm more enlightened now. The other thing here is he begins this discussion about a cup of blessing and of the bread. Now you know where he's going with that. He's going to tie in the very next chapter, the communion, which we're going to get to chapter 11 on Sunday morning. And so he starts talking about being careful not to eat or drink condemnation from the world. And he's going to talk about how when you go into an environment, there are certain things you don't have to ask. It's kind of like don't ask, don't tell when it comes to eating and drinking. If I don't know what it is, just let me eat it. If I don't know what this is, just let me drink it. Now, I was warned when we were in Cuba that the Lord's Supper was wine. I don't know whether, that's kind of a, I don't know. Sometimes I'm glad they told me. Other times I might have been just happy to think it was just sour. It's fine. But sometimes it's good to know ahead of time. He says when it comes to eating and drinking, if it's put before you, just eat it. Just drink it. Don't ask any questions. To keep yourself from offense, and also to keep from offending the person who's sharing it with you. But if they start bragging about it, then you might have a problem. I used to have a practice, and since Sarah's not here, I can talk about it. When we were first off, early on, married, we were very poor. And we would have friends, we wanted to have people over. But we just didn't have a lot of money. We couldn't go out to eat all the time. And my parents and grandparents, we were deer hunters growing up. That's how you ate. Everybody had to hunt and kill something, and you put it in the freezer and you eat it through the year. So when we went back on Christmas break, we would bring back coolers full of deer meat so we could have, especially hamburger. That's easy. You can use it for anything. And Sarah would say, think anybody's going to get disappointed or worried about it being venison? I'd say, no, it'd be fine. So what I would do, and I did it probably 12 or 15 times, she could tell you, we would make spaghetti, for instance, and I'd chop the meat up, put the sauce in, and everything, and she'd make the noodles, and we'd have the meal. And about the time they're getting down to the last bite or two, I'd say, was that good? Say, yeah, that was great. Oh, it was good. Have you ever had deer before? No, like venison. I was well, that's what you're eating. And I would do it every time. Why do you do that? And I said, I just think it's funny. Because you could, I don't know, I could never kill a deer. Well, I did, and you're eating it, It's better to just eat it and not ask any questions. Just do it. And it's an interesting concept that's going to be dealt with more in chapter 11, but the gist of it, he's saying, when you're in your element, you focus on what is before you. We don't need to really worry about, when we come together and take this communion on the first day of the week, we focus on what it is for. We think about the purpose of it. We begin to eat and drink, and so again, we get our souls right, our hearts right. He focuses on the fact that we're one body, one fellowship of believers. The Hebrew nation was a spiritual nation, not a physical one, and that's something that's addressed here and more later on in this book. And we see the active work of proselytizing even in Paul's day, but yet God is blending now a Jew and Gentile culture into his kingdom. And so he talks about that in the eyes of the wisdom of the world. The third thing is about their image. Now, we've dealt with this previously. Corinth was so concerned about the way that they were viewed. They were so worried about visitors coming in to see what they were doing, because they didn't want to offend somebody somewhere else. They were worried about how other churches viewed them. They were worried about how the world viewed them. They were worried about, and this is the reason why they have such an acute case of preacheritis. Because when a new preacher comes to town, they want to appease that new preacher. Oh, well, Apollos is here. We got to try to adhere to everything he says. Oh, Peter's in town. We got to really adhere to everything Peter says. Paul, we got to follow Paul, and Paul's so confused with that in the first chapter. And so they were worried about their image. Paul is understanding of that. He addresses that. And so then he says, let me give you a concept, which again is something he said multiple times in this book. Just because I can doesn't mean I should. All things are lawful for me, but not all things are helpful. Not all things are beneficial. Just because we can doesn't mean we should. It's a higher principle of living, is knowing that everything's at your disposal, but you can say no. You can reject it. And it's actually edifying, and it builds up your character when you do tell yourself no. It's hard for some of us. It's hard for me too, to be able to say no to certain things, especially when we had a motto in our family growing up, and that was make them pay for having buffet. So if you went to a buffet or an all-you-could-eat, you made them pay, buddy. And I'd stand around that dessert table, and I'd get a cup with ice cream, and just fill it. And I'd eat the whole cup and do it again, I love food. Still, you can tell I love food. It's a temptation, a severe temptation. Paul says just because you can do it doesn't mean you should do it, because if you're thinking about the spiritual part of your walk with God, you should learn to tell yourself no. You shouldn't worry about the image that you're portraying to everybody else. That should come secondary. And he talks about, later in chapter 15, being steadfast and immovable. He's going to talk about shining our light for the glory of God. But the highlight here is saying doing it for God's glory and not for the glory of men. Paul himself struggled with this issue, especially with the Jews. Paul's not immune to struggling with these kinds of temptations. I'm never going to go talk to the Jews again. I am not going to do it, he says. I will not. I'm done with them. Wash my hands. And then guess what? He moves into the parsonage. He moves into Crispus's house, who is the leader of the synagogue. I'm never going to the synagogue again, but he's going to move into the preacher's house, okay? Paul wanted so badly to walk away, but he still finds himself teaching Jews, talking to Jews. In fact, Paul himself struggles with the matter of circumcision. He'll go before the Jerusalem council, and he'll say, look at this preacher. You tell this Gentile preacher he shouldn't be that he should be circumcised. You tell him, he's out preaching and baptizing people. Tell him he shouldn't be circumcised. And James and the other apostles go, okay, let's write a letter to the whole church. Circumcision's not next. What's the first thing Paul does after that? He circumcises that preacher. What for? Paul is probably most famous for taking a Nazirite vow. He's a Christian. He's no longer someone of that. Now, it's, of course, his heritage, being a Jew. What's he doing these Nazirite vows? What's he doing going to the temple, getting into trouble? Why is he even going to the temple again? Because Paul is trying to reach people. He becomes all things to all men, that by all means he might win some. Read the book of Acts. Read the book of Galatians. Paul desperately worried about his image, and so he's sharing with them his own struggle. The real problem at the center of these three things is conforming to the image of man, and Corinth had fell for the trap. In the Australian bush country, there's a little plant known as the sundew plant. It's a slender little plant. It's got a tiny stem on it, and it's got little leaves on it with hairs that glisten like drops of liquid. And I think I've got a picture on here of that. Nope, I don't. All right. That is not what I was looking for. Yeah. Actually, no, that's a different bridge. Let me see. I skipped something, didn't I? Anyways, there's this little plant that has these little droplets on it, and these bugs will get down on there and get trapped, kind of like a Venus flytrap. They close tightly around it. The pitcher trap, the Venus flytrap, all of those things. There's a whole page or a channel on YouTube devoted to carnivorous plants that actually eat creatures. I had a video I was going to show you of one of these things eating a beetle and boiling it and then eating it. Flies, ants, and there's one that swallows a mouse, which is pretty cool, but they're a little too disturbing. You'll have to Google it later. So what is the point? How can we overcome this problem? Well, we got to believe in God's deliverance. Now we can go back to that picture. All right. As the Union Pacific Railroad was being constructed, one of the builders had the approval to build this elaborate wooden trestle bridge. Okay? This is a wooden trestle bridge. The guys on top, they're just finishing it. Now, there are several of these that were built, but this is one of the early ones. And as it was built, the construction is finished. The builder decides to prove that it is strong. He loads a train with extra cars, and he doubles the normal payload and rolls it out to the middle of the bridge and lets it sit there for an entire day. Well, as they're watching the train out there in the middle of this trestle bridge, one of the workers says, "Are you trying to break the bridge? I mean, you doubling the payload, you're setting this out there right in the middle." And he said, "No, exactly the opposite." He said, "I'm trying to prove that the bridge won't break." When God allows trials to come upon us, we have to believe that He is going to deliver us. That He's never going to put so much of a payload on our shoulders that we cannot overcome it. We have to believe in God's deliverance. James 1 and verse 2 talks about that. James is trying to identify to his writers, you got to find joy in your trials to know that God is looking down from heaven as He did with Job and saying, "You haven't tested this one, because I know you can double the payload on the back of that one, and he'll stand firm. She'll take the load." Matt Maher has a great song out now that's called "God is My Deliverer." And it's echoing several passages from the book of Psalms. And we remember what Paul himself has said in Romans chapter 8, that God works things together for good, as I shared with you earlier about the medication, not to fret over it. God is going to use that in some way for His glory. God doesn't want us to be conformed to the world. He doesn't want us to be conformed to the image of the world. He wants us to be renewed by our minds. He wants us to live in a daily sacrifice. I was reading through 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 13 again, and it's one of those passages you've memorized or you know well. And I noticed three things there that just really come to my attention. One is he says, everything that we face is common to man. When you're struggling with something that is so difficult, realize that you're not the only one who's had to face something like that. It is common to man. People have faced similar trials before you. They're facing them now while you're facing it, and they're going to face it after you're gone. All temptation and trial is common to man. The second thing, and these are all C's, by the way, is it's controlled by God. God knows how much we can bear. Now, He has a lot more faith in me than I have in myself. Amen? You feel that way? He has more faith in me than I have in myself because I want to say, God, no. Dial it back. Bring it back 2 or 3 notches because I can't take it anymore. But it's controlled by God, and God says, that's enough. No more. And the third thing is that it can be conquered with God's help. God always provides a way. Now, it talks about a way of escape. But some people find that to be the most comforting part of the passage. I find that sad. That as soon as the trial starts coming upon me, Lord, get this off my back. You said I can take a burden that's easier than yours. Show me that open door. Show me that way of escape. Give me a window. I don't even need a door. Just give me a window, Lord, because I can get out of it. And oftentimes we look at that passage and we just, oh man, that's the key, is looking for the window or looking for the door. It's like getting on a plane and saying, where's the exit? But that's not the purpose of 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 13. Really, the purpose is for us to understand God has it in his control, and he can and will deliver us. Second of all, is not only do we need to believe in God's deliverance, we got to receive God's knowledge. We got to stop looking at things the way the world looks at it. We need to completely reinvent the way we think. When bad stuff happens, it's just the end of the world. This is just, we're so blessed that we don't know when things get taken away. Yesterday or day before, Isaac and Seth's back, but Isaac, I told him, you can have whatever you want to eat, this weekend, since it's just me and him. You sleep in the bed, watch video game, movie, whatever, it's the weekend, it's okay. And so we made a decision we were going to go to Starbucks. So we go to Starbucks, I said, I'm going to buy you a drink. We go to Starbucks, line's huge, can't get in. I said, you know what, we're going to drive up to Daphne. We get to Daphne. We get to that Starbucks, and guess what? The power just went out. The power just went out. We can't even make a coffee. You kidding me? I just drove. Because we're going to the Bay Bears game. This was, what was that, Friday night, Seth? Thursday night. I was like, all right, that's fine. We're going to go on down the road. So we get on down the road, and I realize it's going to be too far out of the way, so we're going to go ahead and go to the game. After the game, we're going to go get Starbucks after the game. After the game, guess what? Starbucks is closed. All day I've been promising we're going to get a Starbucks drink, and we didn't get a Starbucks. Sometimes things happen like that. That's just silly, but it's an illustration. But sometimes things just continue to happen. Understand that there's a reason why things happen. Satan has a devious plot for your life. As much as we know God has a purpose and a plan, Satan wants to sabotage it. And Satan knows the way God works. He watched him work before we got here on the planet. And Satan wants to destroy our way of thinking and our way of life. We're so blessed. We don't even know what to do. We have so many wonderful blessings. And Satan's going to try to circumvent those blessings. Or he's going to make us look at them in a little different light. We need to receive God's knowledge. Look back over the temptation of Adam and Eve, over the temptation of Jesus, and listen to what John says about the lust of the flesh, lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. You can be prepared for those trials. God is wanting us to receive his knowledge and his wisdom. We can get the game plan. And then be aware of the arrows that Satan is throwing against us. And number 3, finally, conceive God's plan. Now, the word conceive, I don't mean with come up a better plan than what God has for your life. But what I'm saying is let God's plan be born into your mind. There are oftentimes things happen, and you go, man, that was a pretty good idea. But yet, Ecclesiastes tells us there's nothing new under the sun. God's plan needs to come alive in us so much that it's almost like we have a completely new life every single day. Go back to the previous verses. Where's Paul coming from? You have a crown. God has a plan. You need to choose. Basically, he's saying you choose to be a judge everywhere, but what you really need to do is err on the side of love. You choose to be a person who tells everybody else what to do. You want to make up the rules. You want to follow the traditions. He says, leave people alone and determine their own walk. Now listen carefully. Christianity is not about everybody towing the line, walking tall, marching across the finish line. The writers of the Bible have shown us over and over about loving God, seeing God's plan for individual lives. Not every conversion case is the same. Not every story has the same ending. Look at how God used evangelists and converts. Look at how there's so many different personalities of people who have struggled and stumbled. God shows how all of them blend together. It's about walking next to each other when times are tough. It's not about keeping our noses clean. We have trouble falling and stumbling into trouble. It finds us, doesn't it? So Paul's saying, think about your conscience and where you are. Worry not about all the other people around you. And then he closes with that final thought about just trying to be, or to encourage others to be more like Christ. Maybe just trying to live around people and not judge them, but simply loving people, becoming all things to all men. And you do that by letting God's plan come alive in you. I want to close with just a few stories, and the lesson will be yours. About a boy, first of all, that spent all Saturday afternoon with some friends, and they usually walked around the train tracks. They made their way down to a canal, knowing that the water was low. And the boy was tempted. He was tempted to get in and go swimming. But his father had already warned him multiple times not to go swimming in the canal. He told him, he said, the water level is deceiving, the current is fast. And the boy had promised his father that evening before, I will not go swimming, especially in the dark. I will not go swimming in that canal, after the warning of his father. When he came limping in that night, carrying a wet bathing suit, his father said, you knew the canal was deceivingly low. You knew that there were problems. You knew that I had told you not to dive into the canal. Did you do it anyway? And he said, yes, sir, I did. And he said, why did it happen, son? And the boy tells the whole story. He didn't want to go swimming. He went down there, but then he put on his bathing suit and jumped in anyway. And his father said, I told you not to do it. Yeah, I know. Why did you do it then? And he said, well, again, I just put my bathing suit on and jumped in. I couldn't resist the temptation. What was the problem? You see, he took his bathing suit with him. He took his bathing suit with him if you don't want to fall for the temptation, don't take your bathing suit with you. He knew going, as father told him, he knew he shouldn't do it. He did it anyway, and he took the problem with him. He already had a thought in his mind. It doesn't make much sense. Some people fall into temptation, and they make plans for the disaster. It's almost like they want it to happen, that they expect it to happen. Romans 13:14 says, do not make provisions for the flesh. Whenever we play with temptation, it's easy to drift. It's easy to drift. Let us behave, he says, properly as in the day, not in carousing and drunkenness, not in sexual promiscuity and sensuality, not in strife and jealousy, but put on the Lord Jesus Christ and make no provision for the flesh in regards to its lusts. A young boy in June was struck down here in Fort Morgan during a tropical storm. Out on the beach. We know it was dangerous to be out. I'm not trying to judge. Even last week, a family caught in a rip current, swept out to sea, and we read the story, and isn't it great, 40 some odd people out there linking arms and bringing somebody in. But again, poor decision making leads to trouble. Sometimes the storms and the disaster have a happy ending, and sometimes it is a sad ending, but it all comes back to poor choices, poor decision making. We've got to consider our actions and be held accountable when we make mistakes. We've got to learn to take responsibility for our own actions. Throughout this lesson, we've noticed things about conformity, and I want to bring you back to that passage from Romans 12:1 and 2, which are my favorite passages in the Bible, that remind us it's not about conforming to the world, it's about transforming our mind to be more like Christ. It's hard in the world we live in. Everybody expects us to be just like the world. And if you're not like the world, you're odd, you're weird, you're strange. Doesn't make any sense. Why can't you just fit in? Why can't you just go to that movie? Why can't you go to that party? Why can't you be around that person? Why can't you tolerate this sin? Why do you have to get so bent out of shape when we talk about homosexuality? The world doesn't understand the way we think. They don't understand the way that we work, the way we operate. Paul's saying, don't conform to the world. Be like Christ. Tonight, we offer an invitation as we do every time we're together. And I don't know what you're struggling with. I don't know what pains and temptations and trials you're facing. But I encourage you to lay them at the foot of the cross. And we're going to offer this invitation. It's not just for salvation, which is huge, it's great. We baptize, have our sins forgiven. We offer that to you. But you may be struggling in a sin and feel like the weight is more than you can carry. The great thing about being in Christ is coming for prayer. If you need encouragement or prayer, we can help you. I want to stand.